So, dear Gary, so
Hi, Sasha.
yeah, so I'm very happy to see you, and
Nice to see you. Yeah, so
so
happy.
this morning I was thinking about our conversation, and I went for a walk. I'm staying at the small village not far from St. Petersburg, and there is a path where there is no people. So in this time of epidemic, it's safe to walk there. So I was walking and I was thinking of our conversation. I was kind of making some thoughts which I want to share with you. And I got so inspired, as I always getting inspired when we talk to each other. When I came home, I was trying to put them down. And I began to correct what I was writing. And slowly it lost aliveness. It's kind of was like bread which lost its taste. It doesn't taste anymore.
Yes.
So I thought that, okay, I will probably not do this. I will probably just will flow as it goes, as it usually happens when we talk to each other with you.
Yeah, I had a similar experience, Masha.
Yeah. Really?
I had a similar experience this morning. Trying to prepare and imagine the order, and then I realized that our listening will guide us.
All right.
The very act of our listening.
So I was so much. Yeah.
Go ahead.
You know, I was okay. So I was so much hoping that you will come to St. Petersburg this year at our conference, and you will be able to meet our therapists and my colleagues and students, and they will be able to meet you and to talk to you. So there will be conversation with you, and they will participate.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, the epidemic situation changed our plans, and we canceled the conference. So thank you for your that you agreed to have this conversation, and maybe we will be able to show it to my colleagues and to my students, and they will kind of see you.
Yeah, I'm very happy for that, Sasha.
Yeah,
I'm very happy to get to do this. Yeah.
You have you are a psychotherapist, you are a poet, and you are a philosopher. And I saw this and I see this as a crossroads, as a sort of crossroads which has some similar place where they correspond to each other. I was thinking about a thought of German psychiatrist and philosopher Karl Jaspers, who was saying that the goal and meaning of philosophical thought is not in obtaining knowledge about things, about subjects or objects, but in changing our experience of being and our inner attitude toward things.
Yeah.
And this thought very much resonates with what Proust was saying about the real magic of discovery lies not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. So he was referring to poets, musicians, artists who helps to find these new eyes. And actually Jaspers also was saying that the goal of philosophy in a way is to having new eyes.
Yeah.
So I was thinking that you have this position, so to speak, where you have this therapy and poetry and philosophy.
Yeah.
And so I just want to ask you, how is it to be in this place, if it's possible to put it that way?
Yeah. Well, just to pick up for a moment with the mention of Proust that you about that the real magical thing is to find new eyes. I would say the way that applies to listening,
Uh-huh.
it's actually that you could say we listen with new ears, but I would rather say we listen to our listening, and it
Uh-huh.
begins to open up so that the listening experience that we have, whatever organizes its structure and the way we're familiar and sort of conditioned to listen, when listening opens up, we start to listen to that listening, and as we do that, that opens up. And that might be what Proust was referring to about not having new landscapes to see, but to have new eyes to see what we've already seen, and to see more of it, to see deeper into it, to see it in all its dimensions that might be limited by the way we first see it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So just to take up with it that way. Yeah. But I also
So,
want to, yeah, go ahead, Sasha.
so just to follow what you were saying, so what is listening to you?
Yeah. Yeah. Such a good question. And I feel like that question has become for me the most fundamental question of my life experience. You know, that as I look back in time over my life, I realize I was listening to the prairie where I grew up, and the farm and the life out on the prairie of Montana. That was listening to it in a way that it was informing me, but I didn't recognize that I was listening. I was just being there as a kid growing up on a farm. And then I went off to study to be a minister, and I fairly quickly decided not to pursue that because the exclusivity of the conservative Lutheran church that I was part of, it felt like it was too constraining. But I stumbled into the study of philosophy during those school years, and that opened up a kind of listening to ideas. But even that became sort of constraining because it felt kind of abstract and dry, until I met a particular teacher whose name is Henry Bugby, who became a teacher and mentor and friend to me. And his way of doing philosophy, his way of participating in the philosophical inquiry, opened up something for me to the way we can listen to ideas. Like each idea has its own story, has its own shape, and when listened to openly, like a story, like Henry, when he would teach, he would start to tell the story of an idea. And I realized that if I listened to the story, the idea would come not so much just as a linear abstraction, but as a lived experience. And that was really inspiring to me. And then much later, after teaching philosophy, I started to write poetry. And the writing of the poems was informed partly by the listening with Henry. And one of the themes in Henry's teaching was always, how does something lay claim to you? How does something capture your attention? How does something break into your awareness and capture you? So you really want to focus on that. And when I would write poems, I would go back to the memories of growing up on the prairie, and something like a fence post would really capture my attention. And I realized I could go back through that memory and rediscover that I was listening to the fence post in some way, that the fence post had a story. It had its own life, its own being, and it had touched me in some way. It had, in Henry's words, laid claim to me. So that began my experience of writing the poems that I was writing, that they were kind of a phenomenological exploration of my life on the farm. So I was seeing it with what Proust might say was new eyes. I was seeing what happened to me on the prairie by listening to the listening itself that had happened back there, but listening now in a new way by noticing how something had happened inside me with the listening to the fence post. And if I listened inwardly, my experience of listening to what was out there opened up. And and that began to reorient me so that I became much more captured by listening to how things lived inside me, the experience of my history and my conditioning. And that led me into my own psychotherapy process. And then that opened up another whole dimension of listening. So in answer to your question, what is listening for me? I see that it's the thread that runs through my whole life. It starts off with listening to the prairie, and then it's listening to, in a way, the call to go study to be a minister. But then the religious structure left me, somehow not satisfied. And that then led me into the listening that philosophy offered, and particularly through the way Henry Bugby mentored me to listen philosophically. And that led into the making of these poems. Henry was always very respectful of my growing up on the farm, and he would always ask about it. And I would tell the stories of growing up. And I realized I went back to those stories as I wrote the poems. So each poem became a kind of story of something, like the story of my experience with the fence post, or with the hills, or with the grass, or the wind, or the animals. And then when I started noticing that I was listening inwardly, which led me into psychotherapy, when I was starting to struggle in my life with some depression and certain things that were really hard, and I started listening through the psychotherapy orientation, then listening had another dimension. So as I look back now, listening is that theme, as I say, that thread that runs through all these different parts of my life as it has unfolded. And I should mention, when I studied philosophy, in my graduate work, I worked on the ancient Greeks, and I translated the poem of Parmenides from about 500 BCE. And I learned another experience of listening, because there I was with the Greek, and I would sit with the poem and with the lines and the images that came from that poem. And instead of doing all the sort of traditional research on what other scholars had said about Parmenides, I really focused on what is my experience if I just listened to the Greek. And I realized in retrospect, much later, that I was actually listening to Parmenides. I mean, I was doing it by translating the Greek, but there was a listening experience happening where I felt like I had a relationship with Parmenides. Even though I'm 2,500 years later in linear time, it felt like this was a current relationship, and that there was something about Parmenides' awareness and his astonishment and his fascination with the theme of being that he was reflecting on that touched me. And it touched me in a way similar to how the fence posts touched me. Like there was something in the presence of this thinker, Parmenides, that just like there was something in the presence of a fence post that touched me and laid claim to me some way, that I was organized, my listening followed that pathway, like like guidance, like the listening had some sort of guidance in it that took me into that passageway, that journey, if you will. And so listening, this is all in response to your question, what is listening for me? And I don't know how to sum it up, but those are some of the reflections that come to that question.
Thank you. But what is very interesting in hearing this is that philosophy, studying philosophy and translating Parmenides kind of coincide. Your poetry writing and your studying philosophy was kind of happening almost at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
they were happening at the same time. And then as I started to do psychotherapy and doing my own psychotherapy and then studying psychotherapy as a different models of doing psychotherapy, and then preparing to start having a practice of psychotherapy, what I realized at some point is that the very same energy of that listening was showing up there, that sitting down with a client in a psychotherapy session sort of activated that same listening energy, that same listening, like letting myself listen to somebody's story in a way that it could lay claim to me, that I could let myself be touched by something in the person's story, and that would organize and guide my listening. And so that at some point I could do for a client something like what I was doing in my own psychotherapy, which was I could listen to the story the client was telling. And then I could also listen to their listening and help them see and begin to listen to their own listening by reflecting that back to them. So that started to overlap with and weave in with the listening of the poetry and the philosophy. Yeah.
So you were listening to your listening, you were listening to their listening.
Yeah.
And you were listening to what is touching you.
Yeah.
What is real in this.
Yeah.
And I remember you were telling me about Henry Bugby and his influence, and how he really was close to the nature, to the life in nature.
Yeah.
How he has this incredible capacity to see life.
Yes.
See, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And what Henry would say about his philosophy is he once says in his book called The Inward Morning, he says in some passage there that his study of philosophy took place partly at his desk with textbooks and reading philosophers and reflecting in that way, in that academic way. But his philosophy also took place when he's out walking in the wilderness, in the woods, and walking along rivers where he would hear the sound of moving water, and how that was always some kind of guidance for him, that it always opened him. And he says someplace that when he was younger in graduate school, he spent some time in the Northern Canadian Rockies. And he said for 40 days, he was up there by himself and walking every day. And he said at the end of the 40 days, he felt himself to have been instructed for life, though he would be hard pressed to say what the instruction was. It was a beautiful thing.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah.
You also told this incredible story about him having conversation with Heidegger once.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Because I think this corresponds with his seeing the nature as a source for philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah. So very briefly, that story is that Henry had become friends with the French philosopher Gabriel Marcel, and he spent a year in France living near Paris where Marcel lived. And it was 1955, and Heidegger was presenting a set of lectures at some conference in France. And the lectures were on the theme of what is philosophy? It's a little bit like the question, what is listening? But different. And so Henry attended this conference, and Henry would go out each morning during the days of this conference, and it was at a place where there were gardens and woods and a pond or lake, and he would walk, and he would notice that Martin Heidegger and his wife were walking each morning too. And he listened to Heidegger for several days give his lectures on the question, what is philosophy? And Heidegger formulated it that the way into philosophy was to go back and study the ancient Greeks. And you had to really study those pre-Socratics and then Plato and Aristotle, who formulated the Greeks' astonishment with the theme of being as metaphysics. And if you studied that for 10 or 15 or 20 years, then maybe you could read Nietzsche, and then maybe you could enter philosophy. And so Henry sat down in this conversation with Heidegger and proposed another possible way to enter philosophy. He said, what about if you're out walking and you're walking near a pond or a lake and you're walking along and a frog jumps in the water and you hear that sound of the water splashing and it captures your attention and claims you and you start reflecting on that experience. Could that be a way into philosophy? And Heidegger's response fairly quickly, I gather, as Henry told the story to me, was no. You couldn't enter philosophy that way. You had to do it in this traditional way.
You were saying that someone called Henry Bugby a lyrical philosopher.
Yeah. I think the import or the meaning of calling him a lyrical philosopher was that his philosophy came out of him from his lived experience. Like, he really used his lived experience as both the source of his reflection and what guided his reflection. Now, he also studied the philosophers through the history of Western philosophy, and he was devoted to that study as well. But the way he would enter his reflections on the thoughts of Immanuel Kant or Spinoza or the Greeks or any of those people was always by bringing what they were saying back into his personal experience, so that he would explore the philosophical ideas and concepts out of that lived experience, like how these ideas had an impact for him. And so in that sense, it was more lyrical, because he drew from his own experience and let the philosophical ideas have a life of their own that was not just an abstract linear thinking process. It was a lived experience for him.
This resembles to what you were saying about writing poems.
Yeah.
It's a lived experience for you.
Yeah.
You come to the fence post and listening to your memory.
Yeah.
Or you remembering through your experience, and then it came into certain words. Then you can reflect on them.
Yes.
And it's interesting. I was thinking then, when the poem come out, you also could give it a voice, and you could also hear it.
Right. Yeah. And as I've shared with you before, Sasha, that poem to Fence Post, which maybe since he's translated into Russian, we can both read it.
Right.
But I wanted to say about the poem itself is, once I wrote the poem, I was giving words to that experience. But then, since the poem has been written, and I've gone back to it many times, the poem has its own voice that speaks back to me. And each time I have read this poem to an audience at a poetry reading, I become aware that how this poem comes out of me each time is informed by the listening from the audience that's coming toward me. So the listening of the audience starts to have an impact on me, and then it has an impact on how the poem comes out as I read it each time. So the poem has many different voices to it that I've discovered. So another answer to the question of what is listening, I would say, is that listening is a relational phenomenon. It's not like we're just a passive receptor site and we listen as this passive receptor. Listening is a really active and relational phenomenon. And I have that experience with an audience when I read the poem. I have that experience with the poem itself, that I'm in relationship with the poem. Does that
maybe a poetry? Yes, sure. I just want to add that maybe it's a relational phenomenon, and it's also a manifestation of this relationality.
Yeah. Yes, it manifests that.
It is how the relatedness led to be heard.
Yes. Yes. And that, I think, speaks to my experience with you, Sasha, and the history of our friendship and the history of our dialogue together, that when you and I listen together, something always happens to me. I feel opened up. I hear things that you've been reflecting on as new things that come into my awareness. And then we reflect on that and I respond with something that it reminds me of. But then we travel in this way where the relationship between us is manifested through the listening as we move back and forth. So there's a profound experience of reciprocity for me with you. And it's been true in my whole life with you. It's why I always look forward to when we're going to have a chance to visit. And that the awareness that I have of listening has been informed in no small way by talking and listening with you, Sasha. So I want to say thank you.
It's the same. It's the same. Yeah. Thank you, Gary. The same. Well, is very much resonates with my experience. I remember, for example, when I was writing my book. At that moment, it was more like notes. It didn't have a shape yet. And I came to you, it was, I remember it was 2012, and we were sitting at your kitchen, and we were talking. And I was saying about something about my notes, about this preparation. And you were telling me about Henry Bugby. And you said this, just one word, that someone called him a lyrical philosopher. And at that moment, I got the title for my book, A Lyrical Philosophy of Psychotherapy.
Yes.
And it was amazing because it just came down here to me, and it eases very much the following steps of my work. Yes. Because I just have this direction where I want to go. So yeah, I agree. It's very inspiring for me too.
Just to harvest from that for a moment, Sasha, because I think that speaks to our listening experience. What you are describing that happened for you back in 2012, our listening together, and I happened to mention that the feature of Henry's work, that it was referred to as lyrical philosophy, the way that felt like it just came down something like that's, I suspect, what I mean by guidance. Like when we're really listening, when our listening opens, there's guidance, like things come to us. And you've been writing at this point quite a while for your book, taking notes and writing things down. And that comes and it becomes an organizing principle for your writing of your book.
Right.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Right.
Yeah.
You were saying, Gary, that you could read a poem.
Yeah.
You were saying about fence post, right?
Yes. Yeah, so I will read
fence
it.
Post.
Yeah, I'll read the poem called Two Fence Posts, and then you can read it in Russian. How is that, Sasha?
Exactly, that's perfect, wonderful. I just want to say that we want to thank Victor Kagan for translating your poems into Russian. So your book, having listened, and your book was published in Russian, called
thanks to Victor.
And it's a Victor Kagan. So he will give us, because of his work, his participation, we were able to have.
Yes, I want to personally thank Victor Kagan for his offer to translate this. And I was so touched by it. And it was like a gift from the gods or something that he offered to do this. And so thank you, Victor. And here's the poem called To Fence Post. To Fence Post. It knew my breath and knew my cheek. It was yesterday, a long time ago, when I stood alone next to any old fence post and waited before I knew I was beginning a practice of listening to what stands still a long time. Today, standing any place, that yearning might come for a way in to where fence posts stay without ceasing, each one a priest of stillness. Any day this is so. On a hillside where wind trembles the grass, stands a quiet, gray, weathered post, crust of golden lichen glowing on the shadowed side.
Yeah.
So, can you read it in Russian, Sasha?
Thank you. So I will read it in Russian. I will read it in Russian. Забору. Он узнал мое дыхание и мою щеку. Это было вчера, когда я стоял у забора и вдруг поймал себя на том, что вслушиваюсь в отзвуки далеких времен. Сегодня, где ни встань, тоска может увлечь. На тропинку, туда, где заборы еще стоят, жрецами покоя. Когда ни приди, на склоне холма, в шевелении трав, серый обветренный столб, корка золотого мха светится на теневой стороне.
I'm so struck, Sasha, as I listen to you read it in Russian, the sound of it, because I don't speak Russian, I don't make meaning of the words, I just hear the sound. And this is another reflection on the nature of listening. And it's also relevant to the practice of psychotherapy and our listening to people in that context, like the sound that comes when someone speaks. If you just take in the sound without the linear thinking system making meaning of it, you just let the sound in, you start to hear with other parts of the listening system, not just, I mean, it's certainly the ears and the auditory system, but there's the whole body starts to respond to this sound that the thinking mind is not capturing and making meaning of and claiming ownership of the experience of the poem. It's like my whole body comes alive and I feel it in my heart, I feel it in my belly, I hear it in my heart, I hear it in my belly. And so listening is a multi-dimensional thing. It's not just the auditory. And I think, as you and I have spoken before, that we listen with the heart as well as the ears. We listen with the belly, and we listen with the eyes, and we listen with the touch, and we listen with our feet and our movement. There's so many ways that our listening is informed, so that when we're sitting with our clients, there's so many things that are happening in the dialogue where our listening is not just to the words and just to the meanings, but to the way the giving voice to the experience the client is offering, the way it manifests through their whole being, how their face moves, how their gaze moves, how their body moves or goes still, how their voice modulates. All of those things are part of the experience. Yeah.
So it is what you are saying. tells me that it's possible to listen the melody of poetry, even not knowing the language.
Yeah.
That there is some senses in just melody. So melody, the music of words, have the senses.
Yes.
It's a little bit, I don't remember how he exactly put it, Robert Frost.
Yes. Yeah.
He was saying something, sentence sounds, something, he uses this.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
when you hear something behind the door, like people may talk behind the door to each other emotionally,
Yeah.
you don't hear the words, but you can hear what's happening there. You could
Yes,
hear the
exactly.
kind of the sentence sounds
Yes.
of it, and it's like it has its felt sense, so to
Yes.
speak.
Yeah. I
It's
love that.
possible. I don't know.
Yeah, that
I
felt
think that
sense.
the
Yeah,
poem has its felt sense. Mhm.
exactly. It does. Yeah.
Mhm.
And in the work of Eugene Gendlin that he calls
Yeah,
focusing, he
yeah.
uses that notion of felt sense, and
Mhm.
he talks about helping the
Mhm.
client
Mhm.
discover the felt sense of an experience. It's the same with the poem. The poem does have a felt sense. Yeah.
And I think that there is also a personal response, and everybody may have his or her own response. Like, for
Yeah.
example, when I read this poem the first time, for me, this last sentence, it's about old fence post, which is standing alone, who knows how many years,
Yeah.
and a crust of golden lichen glowing on the shadowed side. Корка
Yeah.
золотого мха светится на теневой стороне.
Yeah.
So there is a treasure.
Yeah.
You could find treasure. It's always hidden.
Yeah, exactly. And when I wrote the poem, I that image came just because I remember seeing it that way. But as I go back to the poem now, I realize that what came into the poem there through that visual experience was a whole sense of what for me became like the hiddenness, on the shadowed side, like how the fence post had a life that had a shadowed side that held
Mhm,
something that wanted to
mhm,
be discovered. Just like
mhm,
as a client myself in psychotherapy, I held so much stuff in the shadows of my experience
mhm,
that wanted to be discovered, wanted to be listened
mhm.
to. Yeah.
And you have a series of poems about fairies and
Yeah.
about your house, about your home,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I could, maybe it makes sense to read the
Yeah,
poem called Farm.
yeah,
Uh, and this poem is reflection of my early years, my growing up experience, and it points toward, in the end, it points toward my leaving the farm. So, uh, and yeah, we can come back and we can talk about it more. But this poem is called Farm. My mother stood at her kitchen window, facing north and wringing her hands, heavy like iron, that I thought I could unwind her gnarl of worry. When my father fixed fence along the creek, he expected supper. She unwound her worried hands to make it, a mix of potatoes, meat, and sorrow. My father ate everything except the sorrow. My brother and I divided it. He, being older, took the smaller share. Evening came. I walked to the barn to gather the cows, to smell the water in the cattle tank, to imagine I was a fin on the windmill, a splinter on the fence post, holding the gate.
So now Russian,
Yeah.
Ферма. Мать стояла у кухонного окна, глядя на север и сжимая руки. Тяжелые, как утюг. И я думал, что мог бы расплести узел ее волнений. Отец чинил забор вдоль ручья и ждал обеда. Она разнимала беспокойные руки, чтобы приготовить смесь картошки, мяса и печали. Отец ел все, кроме печали. Она доставалась мне и брату. Он был старше и брал меньшую часть. Когда наступал вечер, я шел к коровнику собирать коров, нюхать воду в чане для скота, воображать, что я крыло мельницы, щепка и на изгороди, удерживающая ворота.
Again, it's so beautiful, Sasha, to hear you read this in Russian and to have the experience of the poem that I've just read that has the meaning it has to me, and then to hear it in the Russian and to feel like in my belly, down in the middle of my belly, like something happens as I listen. And I don't know that I could explain in a narrative, linear way what it is that's happening, but I know that the poem is it's landing someplace in me differently when I hear you speak it in Russian. Yeah. And I think that one of the ways this is relevant to our work in psychotherapy, for all of those who are listening to our dialogue right now, how this might be relevant there is when we're listening with our clients and we hear their stories, we so often, I think, focus on the meanings that are translatable into our linear thinking. And actually, there's a lot more happening. Like the client tells a story and it's landing someplace in us that's not just the linear meaning that it has. It's our whole body taking this in, and it's resonating for each of us as a therapist or a coach or a counselor or whatever. It resonates in the field of all of our history and conditioning and the beliefs we have about ourselves and the world. All of that is the chamber in which the client's story is landing and resonating and evoking responses in us. And so our job as a therapist is to be listening to our own listening, so we can actually not just impose our belief system on the client's experience, but we really let the client's experience impact us. And as Bugby might say, lay claim to us, come into us and inform us. And out of that, how we respond to the client and what they might be offering and what they might be asking for, it will come into some kind of shape in the shared listening that will guide them, that will be an offering of help to them. And that we might not even know in our linear thinking minds what exactly we offered or what exactly we received, but we respond out of the depth and the fullness of our listening in a way that offers something. And so when we try to capture what listening is in some conceptual framework, like the framework of a psychotherapy model, it's great. Models are great and they help us guide our listening. But if we try to reduce the psychotherapy process to just the protocol of a model, we will miss so much of what's being offered, and we will miss so much of what we have to offer back. So to speak for that, because I think everything we're saying here about listening, how a poem informs the listening, it's not different from how a psychotherapy session unfolds, that is like listening to a poem. And our task as therapists is to really let our listening open.
I think it's also what you're just saying. I think it's very hard to speak about psychotherapy in a linear way.
Yeah.
It's like when somebody is asking, what is psychotherapy? There are so many answers to this, but they will be the same, like what is poetry, or what is philosophy, but it doesn't get the core. And the core is not linear, and it's not rational.
I think the experience or the field that we always live in is so much richer than what our mind makes sense, the way our mind makes sense of it, the way our mind makes meaning. And that's why I think that in any context, but especially in a psychotherapy context, we want to open the lens of the listening as wide as possible so it can harvest from all of that. Sasha, it makes me want to reflect on your book and what you present in your book about being in the presence of another, and the way you manifest that when you write the passage about sitting with the flower, the way you let yourself encounter the flower and open to that and really be impacted by that, to just listen for what comes up if you let yourself be with the flower. And I wrote that poem that you included in your book, and thank you for including it in your book.
Thank you.
It might be a good time we could read that, because some of our listeners might be familiar with this passage in your book, and it's such a beautiful passage. And when I read what you had written, this poem just came to me. So I'll read the poem in English again, and you read it in Russian. Yeah?
Okay.
When I see the rose, for Sasha, I enter a gorgeous labyrinth, not outside me, but in me. Yet not in me, more between me and this other, but not other and not me. More here, in this soft yellow, this velvet petal's touch. Yet not its touch, our touch, together, ours and not ours. Is it not here where Rose and I gaze into a moment, a depth, yet whose depth? Where our skins meet, and it's called touch, but whose touch? Whose caress? And who caressed? Where the verb I call me meets the verb I call Rose, both verbs, or one verb.
In Russian. And again, thanks to Victor Kagan for translating this. Когда я вижу розу, Саши, я вхожу в чудесный лабиринт. Не я в нем, а он во мне. Нет, даже не во мне, скорее между мной и этим другим. Нет, не другим и не мной, скорее тут, в этой мягкой желтизне, этом бархатном прикосновении лепестка, даже не его, а нашего прикосновения друг к другу. Нашего и не нашего. Не там ли, где роза и я взглядываемся в мгновение в глубину, в чью глубину? Где кожа чувствует кожу, и это называется прикосновением, но чье оно? Кто дарит и кто принимает нежность? Где то, что я называю собой, встречает то, что я называю розой? То и другое? Или одно?
Beautiful. Again, the
Thank
sound.
you, Gary. This is incredible. How it's possible to, it's not just condense, it's inform the, I even don't know how to put it in words, inform the way of being into words in a such way that it speaks exactly as it is. I mean, it's so incredible. And another thing which is incredible about poetry, and this is probably the same about therapy, that when it's about art. It's when you read the poem, you read it and it's like written for you. You are the addressee.
Yeah.
When you see a painting, it's your meeting with the painting. You are the seer.
Yeah.
And you could come to the museums and see the paintings many times. The same very painting will be each time different. You could read a poem, the same poem many times, and it will be each time different. Yeah. And so this uniqueness of the meeting, it's also meeting, you are different each time. Yeah. There was a psychotherapist, Hans Kohn, who said that when you see the client, it's the client who sees you.
Right.
So when this client will come to another psychotherapist, it will be different therapist and a different client.
Yeah.
So it's the same like a poem. It's the same thing. When I read the poem, it's my relationship with this poem. This poem sees me, hears me. I hear the poem, but it also hears me. It's my hearing.
Yes.
It's who I am at the moment.
Yes.
My listening. This is how I am open up in this moment.
Yeah.
And this is incredible. This is...
Yeah. And what's kind of a miracle or magic to me is that you say my listening, like the poem comes to you, and yet the word my there, the possessive pronoun my listening, when you really listen, the my starts to dissolve. The I that is in the my starts to dissolve, and the listening takes on a life of its own and invites that me, that my, out into a field that is ready to change it. And I think this is the magic of psychotherapy, that when the therapist really lets himself or herself be open that way and lets the client, whatever the client is offering, come to them like a poem, like the way you just spoke of the poem. And it goes in, and you as this psychotherapist right now in this moment hear it. But if you let your listening really open, the my in there starts to dissolve, and you give back to the client something that is to be harvested out of the shared experience of this listening. And who knows where that's coming from? Who knows what guides? I mean, if we try to say, well, it's the way I make sense of it or something, all of that's true, but there's something that lifts it up into a wider field, into a deeper field of understanding. And when the client receives that.
Okay, so there was interference with the phone call for me, but now I'm back. I'm back.
Okay. Oh, okay. Sorry.
Excuse me. Could you repeat what you were just saying?
Yeah. It's just that similar to with the poem coming to you, and then opening you up, and who you are is changed by it. Likewise, I think when we sit with a client in a psychotherapy session as the therapist, if we really open our listening to them and then offer back whatever we have to respond, we're affected by it. So what we offer back is shared in the listening field between the therapist and the client, becomes a shared kind of place that opens something up, and there's something to be harvested for the client there that might be healing, that might be support, it might be guidance, might be help in some way that the therapist doesn't even know what he or she said that was helpful, but it came out of simply responding from the depth of their listening. Yeah, that distinction between the client and the therapist, when the listening really opens, that separateness, while it stays there, it also disappears, like for you with the rose.
Yeah, and I just want to continue what you were saying about my experience and how it's like it's actually ours and not ours, as you put it. I think you put it beautifully. Ours and not ours.
Yeah.
I just associated for me with what Brodsky was saying about work of art. He was saying a work of art, of literature special, and a poem in particular, addresses a man tete-a-tete, entering with him into direct, free of any go-between relations. So it's relationship, but not kind of through something. It's just direct. It's he said that lots of things can be shared: a bed, a piece of bread, convictions, a mistress, but not a poem by, say, Rainer Maria Rilke. It can be shared. It's an experience. And so this is so interesting. This is one side, and another side is that poetry offers, and listening to it, and listening to your own reactions, to your own resonance, because poetry requires resonance. It's a part of it, I think, right? So it's a there was a Russian poet, Arkady Dragomoshenko, who had a line in one of his poems. In Russian it sounds «Я люблю тебя, даже не знаю, если ты вообще, если я», which in English, well, pardon my English, because it's hard to interpret poetry into English. I'll try. So, which in English will be something like, I love you, even not knowing if you exist really, if I exist really. So it's a paradox.
It is.
How can I be in doubt if I'm not sure if I exist? But this, at the same time, this captures such a human experience. Like doubts about being in relationships, about is it true or not, something like this. How to define the truth or not truth. And this is amazing and very, very paradoxical.
I love what you're saying there, Sasha. And what I would just add along with it is entering into listening in the way you were just giving voice to. It's like you really, the listening gives you a way to participate in being as it's unfolding right now with this poem or this painting or this client in a psychotherapy session. Like the listening is a vehicle that we travel in together, and we move into this experience of being right now that's unfolding, and we then start to mediate it. We start to make meaning of it. We first of all say, well, the way I hear you, and we start right away to separate subject from the other subject and subject from object. And we start to mediate it then through my subjective set of beliefs and assumptions about reality. Like, well, the way I think about things is this means this, or this means that. But the field of listening, when it really opens and we're there in the moment of what's unfolding right now, all those assumptions and beliefs that mediate our listening start to become transparent. It's not like they go away. But this is what I want to say about listening to our listening. Like, we come to a place where we can witness those assumptions and beliefs as such. We can actually see that I'm hearing this and it means something this way because I assume and believe certain things. But if I didn't assume and believe this way, it could mean something different. So for my client, what they're saying might mean something different than the way I hear it. But in the shared listening, that becomes evident. And that difference becomes evident in a way that the way I, as therapist, am listening becomes made transparent, and the way the client might be listening to their own story becomes more apparent to them. And then they have other possibilities, like, oh, maybe it doesn't mean that way. For example, if somebody has a really active inner critic based on some beliefs about themselves from their early conditioning, and they come to a therapy session and they've just had an encounter with somebody who said something that was upsetting, and it activated that inner critic inside the client. So they were really criticizing themselves and making themselves wrong for the thing that they said that upset somebody. Once, if you listen to that and help the client become aware that it's their inner critic who's doing the listening right now, and that if you open up the lens beyond the construct of the inner critic and what the beliefs and assumptions of that inner critic are, the client might hear with more compassion what happened there. And they might be touched in some way that's healing, so that they can, their inner critic can relax a little bit and let them be present with themselves and with the person that the upset was with compassion, rather than trying to get this right and trying to work it out and trying to go back and make the case for this or that. But where the listening opens that up and takes the listener out beyond their assumptions and beliefs to an awareness that lets compassion come through.
You know, I'm listening to you and suddenly thinking, I have a thought that usually if you ask therapist or counselor something, what they know about listening, the first association will be an active listening skills. Or something like this. And what you are sharing today is so much bigger than that, so much wider than that, that I think that this is like opening up another perspective about listening in therapy. It's much wider, deeper, and more dimensional. So I'm very thankful for this, Gary. And yeah.
Oh, thank you, Sasha. I feel like there is something there. I love how you formulate it, probably better than I could. I feel compelled to keep exploring listening, because it feels like it always wants to be and always is bigger than any way we might define it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we were trying to explore it.
Yeah.
And still, I just want to share with you a phrase of this same poet, Arkady Dragomoshenko, which I told you about earlier. And I thought you would like it. So in Russian, it sounds, узор травы определяет контуры будущих костров. Знаем ли мы то, что узор травм определяет узор будущего? So in English, it's my version. Grass pattern defines the contours of future bonfires. Do we know that the pattern of traumas defines the pattern of the future?
Yeah. Oh, wow. So it's kind of astounding to me. The metaphor of the grass and the bonfires for the trauma and the future, what's the future experiences?
Yeah, future, I think in general, he was saying of the future as an experience, as the life,
Yeah.
or you could put it any way.
Yeah.
He does not clarify.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
like poet
Yeah.
never
Yeah.
want to clarify.
Yeah. Yeah. But that's astounding for me. So one thing I take from that, Sasha, is he's speaking of, like how the traumas foretell this future experiences. Like when we listen, when I'm listening to somebody's telling us about a trauma they had in childhood or sometime in the past, what we're listening to is the experience told through the person's experience and way of making meaning of what happened, that was part of what they were conditioned into believing about themselves. And as we listen back through all the way to the trauma as it occurred back in time someplace, what we might be offering clients is a way to listen to how, not only what happened to them, but how their listening was shaped by that experience. So even the way they make meaning of that trauma now, 10, 20, 40 years later, is informed by the way the listening was shaped. And when we listen to them back to the experience and help bring into awareness the assumptions and beliefs they've taken on about themselves exactly because of that trauma, when that becomes available to their listening, their whole experience shifts. And that's where there's another dimension to this for me, which is when we are able to move back through those structures, what some therapists call procedural memories. That's all the assumptions and beliefs that we've taken on in the course of our life and our conditioning. When we listen back through, we get back to what I think of as, the word I've used is the bedrock of the person. Some people use the word the blueprint versus the imprint, but we get back to what might be the essential nature of the person, or others might call, like a Saggioli would use the word soul. We get back to the soul dimension of the person, like who this person essentially is before being conditioned and shaped by the trauma, and their listening also being shaped by that trauma. So our listening is to help them begin to notice how they listen to themselves now in life that's rooted in that old trauma. And so that's where this gets really exciting to me, is when we move back through the history to be able to open the listening up to capture that soul dimension of the person's experience. Like, whether you like the word soul or essence, whatever word you use, the blueprint, the original nature, to get back to that feels to me like the gift that listening offers.
Gary, thank you very much.
You're welcome, Sasha. And thank you, Sasha. Thank you. I so much appreciate being in dialogue with you, Sasha. It always opens my listening up, and it makes me aware of how listening is always prepared to open more. It's always prepared to open more. It's its nature, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So
and here we are.
Yeah. So here we are. So how do you feel about our meeting today?
Oh, I'm really touched by it. I hope it will be useful to anyone who listens to it, and and I guess we'll see. But it would be wonderful to know how it lands for people, and to respond to that in some way, if that's possible.
I hope so. I hope so too. And I hope that in the future, after these all epidemic things will be finishing, we will be able to invite you in person to St. Petersburg.
Oh, yeah. I would love that. I would be honored by that.
We'll be able to be together. Yeah.
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 And I want to
so thank you very much.
You are welcome, Sasha. And I want to just add one more thank you and a real honoring of Victor Kagan for his wonderful work in translating these poems, so that we can share them back and forth.
Share this too. Thank you, Victor.
Yeah. And thank you, Sasha.
Thank you, Gary. Yeah. Goodbye.
So long.